behavior is a vital component to any video game that relies on player skill regarding some combination of timing and coordination. Nailing enemy behaviors across a wide range of enemy types can provide an invaluable tool for game designers to offer creative challenges to the player as they progress through a game. Before we jump into combat-focused games like Eevee, let's take a look at old-school 2D Mario and examine how creative use of simple enemy design can go a long way. First, we see a Goomba moving at a set speed from right to left. If you've never played a video game before, we may learn that you lose a life when you touch the Goomba from the side, which encourages us to try pressing a button on the controller. Then we learn that we can not only jump, but if we bounce on top of the Goomba, they get squished and die. Now that we know how to jump, we may want to see what happens if we jump into the blocks above our head, which teaches us about the difference between question blocks and bricks. A bit later, we observe Goombas will change direction if they hit a solid object, and then right after, we learn they'll also change direction if they collide with each other. Next, we're taught that Goombas can fall off ledges just like the player, so now we know to watch out if they're above us. This is also intended to teach us that we can kill enemies by smashing them from below, which in turn provides us with our first fire flower. Now when we see the next Goombas in this Koopa, we're likely to see what happens when we throw fireballs at them. And this only covers a small portion of what 1-1 teaches the player, so now in 1-2, we again see Goombas, though they're colored differently, and when we see this pair of Koopas, we're likely to learn that when you jump on top of one, it not only defeats it, but sends it flying in a direction based on where the player lands, which can in turn kill other enemies, and us if we're not careful. Next, we're taught about piranha plants and some other platforming mechanics, but I want to skip ahead now to World 4 because, let's face it, that's what pretty much everyone else does. Now in level 4-1, we notice a Lakitu appear in the sky, and he just keeps throwing these red spinies at us. Instinctively, we aren't likely to try and jump on top of these enemies, but if we have fireballs, we'll notice that we can kill them off that way. And if we're really paying attention, we'll also try to smash them from underneath like in earlier stages. But this doesn't kill the spinies, so our only means of defeating them is to use a fire flower, invincibility star, or Koopa shell. Progressing further, we come across a Buzzy Beetle, and if we've become accustomed to slaying all the bad guys with fireballs up to this point, we'll quickly note that fireballs don't work on this one, forcing us to stomp on top of it if we want to eliminate it. Doing so within a pit like this, however, only serves to make our lives much more difficult. By this point, you've probably picked up on the fact that all the enemies have the same basic behavior of moving back and forth and colliding with solid objects or each other in order to reverse direction. The variety comes in how they're placed in the stages to create unique challenges for the player in addition to what power-up the player may have at the time, if any. A Goomba in a wide open level with no ceiling is no problem, but 3 Goombas right next to each other with a very low ceiling requires precision and timing to navigate past, so it's less about the enemy type and more about the quantity and context that determines the difficulty. Now for a quick look at one of my favorite action games. On the surface, God of War 3 may seem to have very little in common with old-school 2D Mario games, and while that's true in a lot of ways, enemy diversity is actually one thing that both games have in common. Well, sort of anyway. Early on, you're introduced to a lot of simple enemies that can be dispersed of with relative ease. As you progress, you'll notice enemies with a lot of different behavior types. Some fly, some shoot, some charge, but at the end of the day, Kratos' expansive moveset can be used against all of them, with some specific attacks being more effective against certain enemy types than others. Facing off against nothing but a single enemy type is relatively simple in God of War 3 because you can use the same strategy against all of them at the same time. But what happens when you face off against 2 or 3 different enemy types that all have different attack patterns and engagement ranges? I call these combat puzzles, and I love them. Take the knowledge you've learned from facing one enemy type, then mix it up by throwing in 1 or 2 additional enemy types, and in some instances, multiple of the same type can also prove challenging. This keeps combat fresh and engaging while allowing the player to feel both skilled and accomplished as they progress and defeat different variations of enemy waves. Now back to Eevee. Most enemy attacks and certain projectiles can be blocked or deflected. If the attack rises from the ground, however, those are more powerful and cannot be blocked, which means they must be dodged. Adding to that, certain hazards like these spikes also need to be dodged, so if you slowly introduce these features to the player, it gives them the tools they need to succeed and feel a sense of progression as more and more layers are added to these combat puzzles. Typically, most enemies will have very similar behaviors in which they wander around their spawn point, only to engage with the player once they're within range and have established line of sight back to the player. At this point, they'll follow the player from a certain range for a bit before moving in for an attack. After the attack, the enemies will return back to their follow range and wait for a set time with some random deviation before moving in and attacking again. This is the core loop for practically all enemy engagements, and while the behaviors are certainly more complex than older 2D Mario games, at a foundational design level, the games are much more alike than they are different. This is because there's a lot of overlap for enemy behavior between different enemy types. To accomplish the system, you'll see that with this selected goblin, there are 2 green spheres following the enemy wherever they go. One just a bit larger than the enemy itself, while the other covers a much larger area. The large green sphere is a trigger volume that will activate the goblin's line of sight logic, which is basically just a ray trace from the enemy to the player with a range of only 8 units. The ray trace is visible in the editor via this red line, and you can see here that it's active on both of these goblins and that they're both always looking directly at the player. So while the game logic knows where the player is, the enemies still don't. This is because they don't have direct line of sight, which basically means that the first thing the ray trace is hitting is a rock. But if the first target is the player, then the goblin's attack logic will activate. The smaller sphere is another trigger volume that represents the attack range of the goblin. So when the goblin knows it's time to attack, they pursue the player until the player is within the sphere, and then they'll initiate their attack. Now in contrast, this imp uses basically the same logic, but they move faster and they wander much further away from the player. Not only that, but their attack range is significantly larger as well, so they're always trying to keep their distance, even when attacking, because obviously they're throwing projectiles at the player. Now when we combine these 2 enemy types together in one space, we get a much more dynamic encounter than if we're only facing off against one or even multiple of the same type. Enemy behavior in most action games doesn't need to be overly complicated, but it would certainly be possible to modify various behaviors on an enemy, so for example, they may attack and then hide from the player for a certain amount of time by checking to ensure they do not have line of sight, only to have them pop back out and attack again. I could even set up the system so after a certain amount of time the enemies stop pursuing the player, as if this were more of a stealth action game. I can also add additional behaviors like an ability to block or dodge attacks when the player attacks the enemy. When you really break down a lot of intense action games, be it Ninja Gaiden, God of War, or even games like Demon's Souls, the behaviors themselves are not complicated, but that's what makes the encounters so great, because it gives the player an opportunity to learn and feel powerful as they progress through the game, learning the different behaviors while the diversity of the encounters start to offer more variety. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this devlog interesting, and I hope to see you again in the next one.